Welcome back to Worth the Effort. I am in production mode this week, but instead of producing yet another video on how to make tops, because I've beaten that horse to death, how about I just do 5 tips on probably the most common tool I use while in production spindle turning, the spindle gouge. So today, let's cover 5 techniques you can do with the spindle gouge. So the first thing I want to talk about is what I call picking up a line. And what I mean by that is all of us are going to make errors and we end up with shadow lines or crescents or divots in our turning. If you're turning a bowl and you kind of shuffle your feet, you're going to end up with an outside curve that might have a high point right there. So detect shadow differently. If you're like me and you're spindle turning, maybe you're turning a bead, and then you just kind of arc over, you have that high point right there, which isn't quite right. The worst case scenario is if you're turning a bowl and or a box or some kind of crevice like that, and you have to switch tools, like you're going from a Irish grind to a bottom feeding grind at the bottom of a bowl, and you pick up your tool. Well, invariably that tool is going to leave this little bit of a high spot before your next tool engages, like that. So how do you get rid of those points? Well, the trick is to feed your tool into it. Don't attack it straight on. If you attack it straight on, you're going to make it worse. For example, this tool right here, if I were to go straight towards that cut, invariably I'm going to do this and end up with a deeper line. And I still got to get rid of the new high spot. So what you want to do in a situation like that is actually come up and pick up the cut back here so you're feeding through it. And you'll continue a smooth line and get rid of that shadow variation. So it's picking up the line means that you're kind of feathering into it. Let me show you in the real world. So whenever I finish one top, I'm always left with this section right here, which I need to clean up so it's the beginning of the next top. And many times I have a situation like this, where I have a bunch of lines, but I don't want to remove too much material because, you know, wood gets expensive when you're in production mode. So if I were to just go aim for this line right here, that's what I mean by removing lines. Come in and just remove that one line. Well, invariably, I'm just going to create another line. What you actually have to do is come back in way behind the line and you're going to pick it up. See, I'm not taking shavings. As I approach it, I start to take shavings way back there and you kind of pick it up. Well, that line didn't totally go away. You can still see the shadow. So I'll come back a little bit farther and I'll begin progressing and I'll start looking for the shavings. See, as I start moving, I'm not picking up any shavings. But as I come back right about there, I start picking up some shavings. And I can gradually get rid of my lines by starting a little bit farther back and progressing in. So the trick I find is starting way back behind the line. I got a shadow line right there. I'm going to start back by here, not taking a shaving. As I progress, you'll start to see some shavings coming out. As I approach the line, I begin my engagement way behind the lines. And I'm doing this really slow for the camera, so it feels kind of awkward to me. But that's kind of how you do it. Start behind the shadow line, progress in. And as you're progressing forward, you'll start to pick up the shavings and then follow through to get rid of your shadow line. Next, let's talk about touching up your blade. Now, as my blades go dull, I keep a little honing stone right here and I can quickly just go through the inside and then kind of curve the outside and I will refresh a blade. But sometimes as I'm turning, I notice I have a line, a shadow line, that moves as the blade goes long. And that generally means I have somehow nicked the blade. It could just be there was a minute pinhole that you went over as as the thing's turning, you can't really notice it. So you just have a small nick on your blade And a hone like that will take too much time to do. Now, when I sharpen my spindle gouge, I do use a jig. I find it's the quickest and easiest thing to do. And a jig like this has 2 points of curvature. You have the point where you drop in here, and then you have this angle right here. Because the geometry of how most spindle gouges are made, in that you have a round tube, and they basically just cut out another round circle like that. It generally goes a little bit deeper, but you get an idea. You have 2 concentric circles. So even though you have 2 points to rotate it around, you can get an even grind going all the way across. And that's key. If you have something like a bowl gouge where the flutes come down like that, curve, and then come back up, well, this is not concentric. So using a jig, well, it's perfectly okay. It's not going to get the optimal design, edge design, because the 2 curves are not concentric. So you can't match a straight with a curve and make it all come out perfect. But really, it's okay. But what I have found is if I use that jig all the time, because you have a more metal on bottom than on the edges, I tend not to keep a consistent side angle on my blade. You know, you have a curve and it comes down like that. This angle doesn't stay the same, and sometimes I get these little hooks like there because the metal up here didn't wear away as fast as the metal on the sides. So what I've been doing these past few years is whenever I notice a line that moves, which means I've nicked my blade, I don't typically use this, and I don't sharpen the whole blade. I just sharpen the tip, which is typically where my nicks happen. And by doing that, I end up grinding more on the tip than the wings. So overall, whenever I do resharpen the whole blade, it all kind of averages out. And how I do that is simple. I do it exactly the same way I would turn a piece of wood. I turn the lathe on, I come back over, I set my hand down, and I will just kind of come down until I see it touching on the edge. And just this action right here. See, I'm watching the side of the shadow, because when you're touching on the base right here, the shadow is above the grinding wheel. Whenever you get towards the edge, the shadow and the edge are in the same line. And once you see that, you know that you're grinding that edge. So then it's just a slight view with the slightest of pressure. So I'm just touching that edge. And once you have the slight burr, get back to work. Next, let's talk about focus when you're rolling a bead. Now, the interaction between blades and grain, I cover a lot more detail in my 4 cuts video. But specifically when you're talking about rolling a bead, for example, I had that top right there and I was just kind of rolling around section right here, which is in effect a portion of a bead. If you watch my focus, it wasn't necessarily getting the perfect roundness. It was using the edge of my tool to create the roundness. Because whenever I started the bead, I'm on top right here. Now, we all know that whenever you are turning this way, you engage that half of the blade, because that's how you keep it supported. Again, we talked about that in the video. So, if I'm at the top of the bead, I want to be my shavings coming off the top of my edge. But as I roll it around, those shavings come across evenly over to about right there, about 45 degrees, as I roll the tool about the same amount. So to create that perfect roundness, I'm focusing on a smooth exit of my shavings. I'll try and do it slow so you can get a close look on the lathe. So as you can see, I've got the rough shape that I want, but as I come across, you're going to notice, can you see where my blade is going to be touching? It's slightly to the side, But this tool right here is almost open, just ever so slightly. And as I rotate around, the shavings will slowly start coming off of different edges of my blade as I rotate it. And it's a combination of the movement to create the edge coming off where the bevel is riding on the wood that creates the curvature I want. So my focus, once my bevel is on the wood, shifts to where the shavings are coming across, are coming off of the blade. So it's up, down until I see shavings, right about there, and then I slowly move, and I'm focusing on those shavings to create my smooth edge. And by the time I hit the bottom, you notice that the shavings were coming off about right there, not at the top. So let's see if I can blend it a little bit more just to get a cleaner line. Once again, coming off the top, and maybe do it a little bit more my speed. I'm going to rotate it and watch where my shavings are exiting the blade. Not quite perfect, but you get the idea. Next, let's talk about finishing cuts. How to get a really smooth edge off your blade, because I ain't wasting my time sanding small stuff like this. Now, knowledge in woodworking transfers. So if you're a power tool user and you're using a thickness planer, how do you make your cuts smoother? You slow down the speed so you're getting more cuts per inch. If you're a hand tool user, what do? With your smoothing plane? You go for those thin, wispy shavings that typically float in the air. Turning on a lathe is no different. Go for thin, wispy shavings and slow down. So as fast as I turn on the very last show face, the front and the back, I'll take one last cut as thin as I possibly can, and I'll just slow down my feed rate. So you want those shavings that are kind of floating in the air, clogging up your air filters as you go down the surface. More cuts per inch, thinner shavings, results in a surface that you don't have to sand. It's pretty much gloss smooth. And yep, if you saw that, I was looking at the camera when I was doing an earlier cut, and I got myself a catch. Finally, my trick for getting long, thin handles is to use all of the edge. I mean, you paid for the whole thing, you might as well use the whole thing. Did you notice what I just did right there? Okay, that is the problem I see most people that are turning nice thin finials want to do. They want to lead with a tip, and when you do that, when you have so little support, what am I doing? I'm coming in and I'm using the whole wing. Look at where the tip of my blade is. It's not even on the wood. I'm using that edge to come around. And when I'm moving quicker, I can see I am way down here on my edge. So I'm kind of using it as a skew. I'm using that wing to give me all the support. And by doing that, I have all of this area that I can rest on my spindle, not that little tiny tip. So you can get really thin finials by using the edge, not the tip. Well, there you go. 5, maybe more slightly advanced tips on just the spindle gouge. And if y'all like this kind of thing, leave a comment below. Maybe I'll do a series. Tell me what other tool you would like slightly more advanced tips on. As always, remember, it's worth the effort to learn, create, and share with others. This was just me sharing some of the things I kind of focus on to keep my turning a little bit sharp when you're doing long, boring production runs, which I got to get back to. Got to play for the wood on the teardrop trailer.